Over the past few years, graded sealed games have fetched a high dollar at auction. A first generation Super Mario Bros. Sold for $100,000, then most recently a Legend of Zelda sold for over $800,000, and now a sealed Super Mario 64 sold for over $1 million. With those high prices attracting more to the space, how will it affect retro video game prices and the retro video game collecting scene as a whole? Welcome to Retronomics, the series that follows price trends in video games, and if you're new here and you like this type of content, consider subscribing for future episodes. Today is going to be a relaxed fit episode. We're talking about graded video games. Grading games isn't a new practice by any means, but now that they're fetching a high dollar amount, it's making it into mainstream news, and that has veteran video game collectors worried about the potential impact on the rest of the video game collecting scene. For those of you unaware, there are two accepted grading companies: the Video Game Authority, who have been around seemingly forever, and Wata Games, which are relatively new to the space, and they are behind those high dollar games that are sold through heritage auctions. To get your game graded, it's pretty simple. All you need to do is send the game into them, and then they'll evaluate the quality of your game based on a number of criteria and then grade it on a sliding scale. Video Game Authority has a 100-point scale and Wata has a 10-point scale, but they mean pretty much the same. The higher the quality, the higher the score. Most of the games sold at auction are 9.0 and above, but there are some lower quality grades out there like Nintendo World Championship cards, but those are a special exception. If you don't mind waiting for up to 6 months for your game to get graded and your game is expected to be worth less than $1,000, then Wata won't charge you to grade your game. However, as the price of your game goes up, there is a sliding scale for how much it costs to grade your game. But hey, if grading your game is going to bring in upwards to $1 million, what's a couple hundred more up front? Now, it should be clear that not every game graded will sell for $1 million, but they do sell well over their non-graded counterparts. Super C, for example, sold for $5,700, but lesser known titles like Hyperzone for the Super Nintendo sold for a measly $372, still higher than their ungraded counterparts. And when you have that much money involved, it does give off the impression that this practice is legitimate and it can invite collectors with deep pockets into the space. Now, it's important to reiterate that these graded games didn't just pop out of nowhere. Wata has, for a while, tried to legitimize the practice of grading games, just like people who grade baseball cards and comic books have been doing for a very long time. And it's well documented that the people who are in this video game graded scene who are coming in have been in the comic book and baseball card scene for a very long time, and now they see video games as an untapped potential. It has also been alluded that these high dollar price tags aren't being fronted by an individual. Instead, it's a collective of people who might have ties to Wata, and they're buying these games to increase the value and hopefully turn a profit over time. Heritage Auctions also deals exclusively with Wata graded games, so you won't find any VGA graded games on their site. And also, there was an episode of Pawn Stars where a graded game came up and the expert that they brought in was a representative from Wata. While the one Zelda game that sold for $800,000 is grabbing all the headlines, if you go back and look at the auction block, there were several Zelda games that sold and the prices were all over the place. For example, there were two original Zelda copies for the NES, both rated 9.0, but one sold for $800,000 and the other sold for a measly $55,000. They're both the same grade, however, the one that sold for way less has a Kmart sticker on the seal. Kind of weird that they're both graded the same, but I can see why one would sell for more than the other, but the discrepancy is way off. Moving on to the other Zelda games, you have 2 Ocarina of Time copies for the Nintendo 64, one a collector's edition rated 9.4 with the gold cartridge, and the base version with the gray cartridge rating a whopping 9.8. And the collector's edition sold for $22,000, whereas the base 9.8 grade sold for 10 times as much at $220,000. Majora's Mask, another 9.8, sold for only $19,000, and then as you go down the list, the prices get lower and lower. So it really makes you wonder how much of these prices are manufactured and for what reason, especially when you see a copy of Super Mario 64, a game that sold millions of copies only 25 years ago at the height of Nintendo's popularity. Now, I can understand a copy of an NES game or an Atari 2600 game go for a high dollar amount. I mean, earlier iterations of video games were functional pieces of entertainment. I know as a kid, I didn't keep any of the boxes of my NES games, and a lot of people didn't even keep them sealed. But there still are plenty of copies of these sealed games out there in the hands of people who decided to pick up pallets from liquidators as new systems were coming in. So no one really knows exactly how many copies are out there, but I wouldn't be too surprised to learn that copies sold on heritage auctions all came from the same box. Obviously, graded sealed game collecting isn't for everybody. A lot of people, myself included, find grading games kind of bizarre. I mean, video games are meant for playing, and you can't play a game if it's sealed, and you definitely can't play it if the game is locked in an acrylic case. The inflated sense of value that is attached to these sealed and graded games is just a number that people put up, and so when you try to unbreak a seal, you're losing the value or something like that, and that can prevent a lot of people from enjoying games the way that they were meant to be. And you might think because you don't collect sealed games that this doesn't apply to you, but a lot of people do appear to equate these giant sales to the rising game prices in general. And I wouldn't really blame you for trying to make that connection. When the sticker seal Super Mario Bros. Was sold for $100,000 in February of 2019, there was a bump of about $20 in the complete in box category. However, in 2021, when another copy of Super Mario Bros. Sold for over $600,000, the price of a complete copy of the game was already on the rise, and the sealed versions didn't seem to take too much of a significant jump either. I mean, it is really hard to tell on eBay because not a lot of sold copies are even sold that way. There isn't a significant jump to correlate with the heritage auction site, and since 2020 was a terrible time to be a game buyer, it's really difficult to determine if the spikes in prices are due to recent sales of graded games or just people were looking to relive their childhood while being cooped up in the house for a long time, and I lean towards that reason. The most recent sale of Super Mario 64 for $1.5 million has renewed fears of these old-time collectors, believing that this will be the turning point where game collecting is officially out of reach for the average Joe. And I don't really think that's the case. Sure, it grabs the headlines and it might prompt a lot of people to check their closets for their copy of Super Mario 64, but these are sealed games that we're talking about. It's not like they're selling graded loose copies. But Wata actually does grade loose copies, but I wouldn't really worry about it too much. I saw it in an auction in 2019, and if you were actually paying attention during that time, you might have actually gotten a deal. The April auction of a graded copy of Mega Man X3 for the Super Nintendo sold for just $89, which it was going for double ungraded. DuckTales 2 sold for $132 during that time, which was only a couple of dollars more than what it was going for ungraded on eBay. A loose Legend of Zelda Link to the Past cartridge sold for $50, which was $20 more than it was going ungraded, so I do really think that people were just throwing things up on the site and seeing what sticks, so I don't really think that loose video games are going to sell well on the same scale as their sealed counterparts. I mean, if you look at the Super Mario 64 listing, there was a greatest hits variant that sold for significantly less. And there really hasn't been any more sold loose games of popular titles since 2019, but we could see the actual rare loose stuff be graded, like Nintendo test cartridges, Star Fox Championship Weekend, and that elusive Nintendo World Championship card. In fact, if you're going to sell most of that old retro stuff that's rare, you might have to get it graded in order to part with it. And those games are, in my opinion, if you really had to grade, I would do so. I mean, they're so obscure that why wouldn't you want to grade them and ensure that they'll be protected for years to come, assuming that you dumped a prototype or anything else before putting it behind that acrylic case. But again, I'm not really particularly concerned that grading games is going to have an effect on prices of games that people actually want to play from time to time. If anything, I would hope that these headlines that these games are selling for a high dollar amount would prompt more people to search their basements, attics, closets, or whatever, and put these games out in the wild again on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, or eBay, or whatever, to hopefully keep the prices reasonable so that way other people can enjoy it. I mean, there are still a lot of people who don't see any value in these old games and will bring them to recycling areas like Goodwill, or worse, throw them in a dumpster and they wind up in landfills lost forever. But I am curious to hear what you have to say. Do you think that graded games spell doom for the video game collecting community, or do you see it as just another tier of collecting? Let me know in those comments down below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with those who might find it interesting. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for future content. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at snicktendo. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Super Nicktendo, and I'll see you next time.